Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first of the 2025 Spring Seminar Series presentations hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Dimitris Krallis. I'm the director of the center, and I'll be moderating to the degree that there is a need for moderation this talk. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Kwikwetlem peoples. Now, I'm really pleased to present today's speaker, an MA student with the Department of Global Humanities and a citizen of Hellenic Studies for quite a few years, Nina O. Nina is currently writing her thesis on depictions of ancient Greece and Rome within contemporary tabletop games. She began researching historical reception in tabletop games as an undergraduate, and as a lifelong lover of Greek history and culture, she's working towards a career as a reference librarian, assisting students and researchers in Hellenic studies, archaeology, and other related subjects. I'm sure those subjects will keep piling on as that career path hopefully unfolds. So without further ado, I pass it on to Nina.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon on this wonderful sunny day. I hope you can all hear me all right. Excellent. So without further ado, let's get into the topic. So my lecture today is called Playing Gods, Portrayals of Greek Mythology in Contemporary Board Games. Now, I should go over a quick definition of what board games I'm working with very quickly. You can see some titles of games that I have been working with in my thesis research up here on the screen. These tabletop games is a really, really broad term that can be used to describe any kind of analog, physical form of entertainment that are typically played with groups of people. And that does include role-playing games, things like Dungeons and Dragons, which are games that people can get together and form groups and play over the course of months, maybe even years. They're very, very interesting, and they do have some cool instances of ancient reception, but I'm focusing in on a more specific type of gaming here. These are all games that can be played between roughly about 20 minutes and 2 hours, and they're one-off games. So a group of people can get together and play them, and they sit together for that little span of time, and that's it, they're done. So there are so many exciting tabletop games on the market right now, and a large number of them deal with ancient Mediterranean antiquity in some way, shape, or form. It's absolutely impossible to discuss how ancient Mediterranean antiquity gets portrayed in modern pop culture without talking about how we deal with classical Greco-Roman mythology. Western pop culture has a very, very long, very well-documented fascination with these kind of ancient stories and adaptations of the ancient epic and poetry and what have you. And this fascination, as you can see from some of the titles here, is alive and well within the world of tabletop games. Games that take place in the ancient Mediterranean, especially games that take place in ancient Greece, are just as likely to be set in a fantasy, imaginary, sort of magic-inflected antiquity as they are to be rooted in recorded history. So I would like to look more closely at these games that engage with ancient mythology and think about how they incorporate ideas from myth into their play. I've roughly divided this talk into two broad subsections. We're going to look at how these games portray gods, and we're going to look at how they portray monsters. I'll be using a few individual case study games to talk about these broad categories. So I'm going to start with looking at how games portray gods. Games that have players take on the role of Greek gods are actually very, very rare. It's much more likely to play a game where you take on the role of a mortal. However, that doesn't mean that the pantheon is absent from these game spaces. There's a lot. Pretty much every game that's based on mythology is going to have one or two, if not an entire pantheon of Olympian gods show up. They most commonly appear as sort of abstract in-game forces, like the gods are built into the components of the game. They're not roles taken on by players, and they affect what happens in the kind of narrative flow of play and might even determine who wins the game. They tend to add a nice layer of complexity to the social interplay of the game because they affect the conflict and competition between players. So let's look at a case study. This game is Santorini. It is gleefully anachronistic and very bright and cartoony, and I love it. Now, let me explain how it works. So this over here, this is the board. It looks like this beautiful little island in the Aegean Sea. And these little figures here, unfortunately, my image is a tad pixelated, but the little blue and gray things, those are player counters. And players take turns moving their little guys, their little pieces around on the board and building these little blocks that look like modern day Cycladic buildings. These buildings date to around the mid 20th century, but this game is set in ancient Greece. Don't worry about it. You have to take turns moving and building and climbing the towers, and the first player to get to the top of one of their towers wins. Super straightforward, but there's a twist. The gods get involved, as they so often do in ancient mythology. At the beginning of a round of Santorini, both players, this is a two-player game, draw a randomized god card, which you can see a selection of gods in that image on the left. And each of those cards represents a different character from Greek mythology. They're mostly gods from the Olympian pantheon. And each god gives the player who draws them a unique power for the duration of that game. They tend to, for the most part, have a little extra ability that players can do on their turn that is nicely themed to the god that they've drawn. So for example, the Hermes card, if you have the Hermes card, you can move greater distances than your opponents. Or if you have the Hephaestus card, you get to build 2 blocks per turn instead of 1. My personal favorite, the Athena card strategically limits what your opponent can do, given that she is the goddess of the sort of cerebral strategic side of warfare. I just think that pairing is kind of brilliant, and the game always gets a little bit more spicy and a little bit more tricky to win if your opponent has the Athena card, which I just love. It's a nice mythologically accurate integration. The players only receive 1 god card at the beginning of every round. So if we stop thinking about players for a second and think of Santorini as its own little mythological universe where this competition is taking place. Mythologically speaking, there are 2 people, 2 mortals, and 2 competing gods or goddesses who have granted these mortals a favor, follow them around, and support their exploits. And these 2 gods are using these mortals as proxies to compete for mastery of an island in the Aegean Sea instead of, duking it out for themselves. There's so many myths where this happens, where gods use their favorite mortals to fight things out and to gain some sense of competition instead of fighting themselves. The main myth that Santorini reminds me of is the contest for Athens, which I'm assuming most people in the room know, but if you don't, Athena and Poseidon both really, really want control over this city. They both love it. They want to be in control of it. And so they gather all of the mortals who live in that city and say, okay, we're going to each give the mortals a gift, and you guys pick which gift you like best. Athena wins. The city is called Athens. It's still there now. There's an alternate history where the city's named after Poseidon, and instead of olive trees going on the Acropolis, there are saltwater rivers. This myth, there's a whole bunch of ancient texts that talk about this contest for Athens. It shows up in Pseudo-Apollodorus. It shows up in Pausanias. He writes about it a lot. And it also shows up in later texts like in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So yeah, Santorini is a nice little simulation of an idea that recurs all throughout primary source texts. And it's a very, very nice introduction to one of the core tenets of divine and mortal interactions in classical mythology. That was a pretty simple, straightforward little game. I was able to explain the rules to you right away, but let's look at something more complex now. This is Cyclades. Again, a gleefully anachronistic cover. The little Cycladic buildings show up again on that central image, which is the cover artwork for the game. But you'll also see there's some later looking buildings that are kind of pastel colored. If you've ever been to the Ionian Islands in Greece, they'll look kind of familiar. They also remind me of some buildings in Italy. And then you've got some ancient Greek monsters, an ancient Greek temple, and a kraken. which is a monster from Norse mythology, doesn't show up anywhere in Greek mythology, but famously shows up in the movie Clash of the Titans from the 80s. So it's always been associated with Greek mythology. The Kraken is befuddling to me, but I'm also not mad that it's there because it's, it's a cool monster. Anyway, Cyclades' rules are much more complicated than Santorini's, but the core idea of the game is that the players are rival leaders of ancient Greek city-states, and they're competing to build and develop their cities, as well as potentially conquer each other's cities. There's a warfare element here in Cyclades. So there are, again, a few Olympian gods who appear as in-game forces, and they help the process of city building and conquest by providing resources and making specific tasks easier for the players. Santorini creates pairings with each god only paying attention to one choice mortal. Cyclades complicates things a bit by demanding that its players seek the aid of multiple gods at once and keep their divine favor in a delicate balance. And the gods are also favoring more than one mortal at once. The players can achieve divine favor by bidding resources and spending coins to appease this little selection of deities. This creates a unique competition between players who can often find themselves vying for favor of the same god. Cyclades features 5 members of the Olympian pantheon, each with their own specialized favor to bestow upon players. 3 of these align pretty well with the mythological record, and they also align nicely with ancient religious practices. The things that you vie for with gods in Cyclades nicely line up with things that the ancient Greeks and Romans might have prayed for. In Cyclades, Poseidon facilitates port construction and shipbuilding, so he assists you with naval combat, which is a big part of the game. Ares builds fortresses for you and also helps you move your armies once you're at the city conquering stage of the game. And then Athena provides universities and philosophers to inhabit her worshippers' cities. So she makes your cities kind of more prestigious and adds this layer of complexity and cultural impact to the game. There's 2 other gods. I did mention that there are 5. They're in charge of really useful in-game functions, but these functions don't align quite so strongly with their actual role in the mythological record. When players in Cyclades try to appease Zeus, they get to populate their cities with priests and build temples. These are, of course, really important core aspects of ancient Greek religion, but they're not exactly specific to Zeus. They built temples to all sorts of gods. Apollo in Cyclades bestows wealth on his worshippers and increases the income that they can collect every turn. He's not particularly associated with wealth. He's not exactly a god of money or commerce. However, in ancient Greek religion, Apollo is a god of prophecy, and modern ideas of financial gain are kind of tied to this sense of gaming the system, making predictions in the stock market, looking into the future. So there might be a roundabout association of Apollo with money through a modern lens that way. So the specialized abilities and the sense of competition among gods in Cyclades is obviously reminiscent of religious activity in ancient Greek city-states, and also of the behavior of gods in ancient texts, including in ancient poetry. The allegiance of gods to the specific cities and to specific mortals aligns really, really well with how the gods behave in a lot of historical epics, especially in the works of Homer. The idea of gods favoring a specific city and of mortals competing for the favor of a god reminds me a lot of the plot of the Iliad and the way that gods and mortals interact in that story world. The resemblance in Cyclades to the role of gods in ancient literature gives the game a sense of depth. As well, there's other games that feature Greek deities in a similar way that kind of have a similar model. So that's Cyclades. We're moving away now from case studies. I have another one for you later, but we're going to put the case studies on pause. And we're going to talk a bit more about a recurring source of inspiration for how these games portray Greek gods. We're talking about Homer. I mentioned the Iliad already, and I talked already about how Cyclades and Santorini are perfect simulations of how the gods interact with their mortal subjects in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Broadly speaking, the players in these games, as mortals, are not privy to the motives of gods, and divine favor can strike seemingly at random. The gods can and will interfere in mortal affairs, both in Homer and in tabletop gaming. However, in both of these areas, they're more likely to summon forces of nature or to inspire favored mortals to do their bidding than they are to take action themselves. The Iliad is full of passages where a god interferes in the battlefield by bestowing extra powers in combat on a mortal of their choice. I put an example, just a little snippet on screen of a really famous passage from the Iliad. It's widely known as the Aristeia of Diomedes. Aristeia is this ancient Greek term. It's all over the Iliad. It kind of means like glory or the apex of one's skills. Like a lot of warriors in the Iliad achieve passages of Aristeia where they sort of demonstrate heightened skills on the battlefield. It's the apex of their power. So the Aristeia of Diomedes is Diomedes at his most skillful. He's plowing through the Trojan forces in a superhuman fashion, quite literally superhuman, because Athena is at his back. In that picture there, you can see him. He's at the front of the chariot with the spear. Actually, he's the one on the left with the back. He's holding the spear kind of aloft. And then the other person in the chariot is Athena. There's a passage of the Iliad where she literally like knocks Diomedes' charioteer out of his chariot and goes, okay, I'm doing this. So the passage that I've put up on screen is the very, very beginning of the Aristeia of Diomedes. It's like the opening of a chapter of the Iliad, and it's a description of him entering an altered state at Athena's hand through her interference. Diomedes becomes so powerful in this passage that he's not only knocking down Trojan soldiers, his enemies, like they're nothing, but he's also able to take on other gods. And this is a rare part of the Iliad because the gods are actually directly interfering in the mortal battle, like they're present on the battlefield. And Diomedes is able to wound a couple of them and send them back to Olympus. Interestingly, a couple of the gods are on the battlefield in this position. But they're more playing a defensive role. Aphrodite is on the battlefield, but she's just there to protect this one Trojan warrior named Aeneas, who is her son. She's not really doing any attacking. And then when Diomedes almost kills Aeneas, Aphrodite kind of whisks him out of danger. So in this passage of the Iliad, we see the gods playing both defensive and offensive roles and interfering with the flow of mortal events on a whole bunch of different levels. This is kind of an interesting parallel to the way Ares behaves in Cyclades. He helps you build armies, so he helps you strike on the offensive, but he also assists in moving forts and helps you take on a defensive role. In Homer, there's also plenty of examples of the gods bestowing mortals with power in situations outside of combat. So in line with the architectural contest that takes place in Santorini, Santorini, as you already saw, is not really a combat-based game. Athena does this kind of peacetime situation power up a whole bunch in the Odyssey. She grants Odysseus courage during a pivotal archery contest toward the end of the epic. She also helps his wife Penelope devise the idea for that contest in the first place and kind of helps her figure out this way to reveal a disguised Odysseus's true identity. The appeasement of and appeal to gods is a recurring theme in Homer, and this is clearly mirrored in mythologically inflected games. The Iliad and Odyssey are also riddled with scenes of ritual sacrifice, either to gain the favor of gods or to appease their anger and alleviate the mistreatment of mortals. This is something that we see in tabletop games. I'll use Cyclades again as an example. Because of Cyclades has that delicate interweaving of appeasement through sacrifice where players have to spend resources to get the gods to give them favors. And also the appeasement of gods where they have to be kept in balance together. You can't give all of your resources to one god, or the other four gods will get angry and they might penalize you in the game. So tabletop games like Cyclades perpetuate some really well-attested ancient ideas about the relationship between gods and mortals. Speaking broadly, when we see long-term, sort of close, almost mentor-like relationships between gods and mortals in myth, especially in epic, interestingly, they tend to be between goddesses and male heroes. So I'd like to talk a little bit about goddesses and how they show up in tabletop gaming. We've already seen Athena really closely track Diomedes' progress in battle in the Iliad and also favor Odysseus and Penelope in the Odyssey. So I'd like to look at an example from a later primary source. I don't want to overload you guys with too much Homer. In Apollonius of Rhodes's Argonautica, which is a great sweeping epic written in the 3rd century BCE, Hera closely follows the hero Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece. She intervenes several times over the course of the story, probably most notably in a ploy to get this princess whose name is Medea to fall in love with Jason and help him steal the Golden Fleece. If you know your Greek mythology, if you've ever read Euripides as Medea, you know that that story has nothing but a happy ending and it's all sunshine and rainbows for the two of them going forward. That was sarcasm. Anyway, Hera doesn't set this couple up all by herself. She parleys with Athena to devise a plan because she knows that Athena is smart and Athena is good at coming up with plans. And then the two of them together in this extended and very, very funny sequence coax Aphrodite and convince her to make Medea fall in love. I've put the citation where I'm getting this passage of the Argonautica from up on the screen. If you do want to look it up on your own time, I highly recommend it because it is very funny. It was too long to put up on screen. It's like 100 lines long. Anyway, this prolonged sequence involves the goddesses sort of scheming, they're bickering, they're like comparing each other's talents in a way that feels very catty. And then they're also speculating about how Jason's adventure is going to unfold. And this passage is fairly emblematic of how goddess and hero relationships play out across mythology, as well as how they play out in tabletop games. Hera obviously doesn't interfere directly with Jason's journey here, but she sets some very crucial pieces of his quest in motion. Like if he hadn't met Medea, the narrative would kind of get dead in the water. She really keeps the plot moving forward. When goddesses like Hera appear in tabletop games, they often demonstrate bonds with the players and exert some level of control over the flow of the game, again, without direct interference. The goddesses in Santorini, Cyclades, and other mythological games play a beneficial support role to their players. It's easy to read the rewards they bestow on players as divine meddling within the game narrative. I'm mentioning goddesses here. Obviously, male gods do this as well, but I thought that the focus on these female symbols of power was quite interesting, especially from a game design perspective. When tabletop games involve mortal heroes, they tend to not be very well characterized. They're usually little more than just a piece that moves around the board. Any sense of character that they get comes from the players. This makes sense from a game design perspective because in order to create a nice fleshed out story world, these games don't need full-blown personas for their players to take on. However, the players can, if they choose, imagine themselves as a role within this world. Like these games don't require a vivid sense of imagination, but I personally find that imagining and situating yourself in the world of the game just enhances your experience of play overall. And the interactive nature of tabletop gaming facilitates this because you're often encouraged to speak to other players within the language of your game world, as opposed to just talking sort of abstractly. When a group of gamers spend an hour around a table talking about the construction of temples or the maneuvering of phalanx troops, it's easy to collectively subsume into a collective imagining of ancient Greece. This imaginary space allows for a lot of harmless anachronisms, including when there is women around the tabletop, the active female presence in historical, military, mercantile, and other public spaces. And these are spaces that some women did, exert themselves in, but historically in ancient Greece, women were not allowed to participate fully in these kind of spaces. But in tabletop gaming, you can be the female leader of a city-state, or you can be a woman at the head of an army, and no one will bat an eyelid. Female players can be architects, they can be generals, merchants, and more, without facing any negative in-game repercussions. Because of the divine presence in a lot of these games, women also get a chance to develop bonded relationships with powerful female figures through these goddesses. So not only do tabletop games allow women to play in historical settings without their gender obstructing their access to space, the presence of goddesses in many of these games cultivates a sense of female support and mentorship. That's why I wanted to draw attention to goddesses. I just think that kind of bond facilitation is very interesting. So all in all, gods in tabletop games serve an in-game mechanical role. They support their players and they encourage interactive competition. They also add immersion to the process of play and flesh out a fully realized world for players to appreciate. Their characterization adds weight to a game narrative, making the mechanic forces represented by gods feel like more than just tools to keep competition balanced and to enable the flow of play. If players come to a game with a pre-existing knowledge of mythology, titles like Cyclades and Santorini take on an extra narrative layer. If they don't, the game serves as an exciting, interactive starting point to explore Greek mythology, as well as a concise and understandable introduction to the behavior of gods. So that was the section on gods. We're pivoting to monsters now. Game designers love their monsters. This is an example. The image here are all creatures who you can encounter in Cyclades. Some of them are from the base game, like the Kraken I mentioned earlier, and some of them are from the game's many, many expansions. It's a rule of thumb that if a tabletop game gets popular enough, it's going to get a whole bunch of expansions, and it just gets more and more complicated as you go on. Anyhow, I'm interested in why these games portray so many Greek mythological monsters. Monsters are an enduring presence in popular media across the globe. I argue that it's probably because they tap into a lot of human anxieties and fears on a primordial level. They speak to us on a very deep note. And there's all sorts of interesting research on why monsters appeal to us and why we keep coming back to these ancient creatures. They often serve as a catalyst for exploring the unknown and the inherent human fear of the unknown. At the same time, monsters often represent or code subaltern social groups. Some of the most popular monsters in Greek mythological games include the Cyclades, the Minotaur, and Medusa. The stories of these three monsters contain themes of ostracization, bodily violence, and physical otherness. They are presented in myth as foes for heroes to defeat, either through violent strength, cunning, divine favor, or a combination of these factors. However, in mythology, these monsters are often characterized as more than just vicious or bloodthirsty. One of the most poignant instances of pathos in the Odyssey appears in Odyssey Book 9, but also on my screen, where the Cyclops Polyphemus has been blinded by Odysseus and his men, and he's in terrible pain. And Polyphemus is a shepherd. He lives on this little rural island. And in this passage, he speaks to his favorite sheep, and he's lamenting his recent blinding and how he's been tricked and deceived by these sneaky humans. And this moment is really quite sad, and it humanizes the Cyclops, and it encourages the Odyssey's readers to see him as more than just like this brutish creature who eats people. He demonstrates empathy for a fellow living being here and maybe seeks some comfort in the sheep's company. It is worth mentioning that Odysseus narrates this episode. He could be recounting events as they happened and, transmitting Polyphemus's words directly, or he could be embroidering the truth and placing the speech in his opponent's mouth. As always with Odysseus, it is hard to say. He's a trickster. So at the surface, the presence of monsters in board games such as Cyclades is not always as nuanced as it is in myth. This is an interesting contrast to their portrayals in works like the Odyssey and the Metamorphoses. I mentioned the Metamorphoses because Medusa is one of the most widely reproduced ancient Greek monsters in tabletop gaming. And in the Metamorphosis, Ovid characterizes her as a very tragic survivor of sexual assault instead of just a straightforward monster. On rare occasions in tabletop games, monsters can take the form of allies. The god cards I talked about in Santorini feature mostly members of the Olympian pantheon, but there's also a few monstrous figures. Medusa is one of them, so is the Minotaur. Regardless of their intention or even their sapience in myth, the purpose of monsters in Santorini is purely beneficial to the players. That being said, it's much more common to have games where monsters play a purely antagonistic role. They're there to hinder the player's progress through the game, or the players get some sort of reward for killing the monsters. One example of this is the game Minotaur. There he is on the cover there in the center. He's a very, very impressive foe, and he's kept immortal in this game. And in the myths, he's very, very mortal. But in the Minotaur game, he can't die. If you kill him, he just regenerates and comes back, so long as he stays inside this labyrinth. So the point of Minotaur, the game, is that the players bond together and travel as a group through this labyrinth to prevent the Minotaur from going free, leaving the labyrinth and killing innocent people. It's not exactly how he's demonstrated in the game, in mythology, but it's a very interesting evolution of some ideas about the Minotaur as a character. Minotaur is really interesting because it really nicely demonstrates an idea that I like to call layered reception. So for those of you who don't know, the idea of historical reception is that Media from subsequent time periods after a historical era are going to depict that time period, but they'll always engage with it in ways that are specific to that time. So like, for example, there's a lot of media from the UK during World War II that it engages with the Middle Ages. And it takes these ideas from the Middle Ages and somehow they all resonated with British people in World War II for all kinds of interesting reasons. And media from that time period tells us more about the collective mindset of the Brits in World War II than it does about the Middle Ages. So the media that I've been looking at here is from the last couple of not centuries, the last couple of decades. And it tells us probably more about the 21st century than it does about ancient Greece. I've already pointed out a few anachronisms, a couple of imposings of modern ideas onto antiquity, but also, you know, a curiosity about the ancient world and a desire to maybe complicate it a little bit. Minotaur does a really great idea of that. So I talked about straightforward reception. That's the idea of engaging with one time period. Layered reception is when a modern day piece of media engages with multiple eras in time. Some of you might feel a bit nostalgic, or you might feel a bit familiar with the pixelated kind of bold art style in Minotaur. That is deliberate. The game was designed with sort of 80s and 90s, late 20th century arcade video games in mind. It's evoking them on purpose. I also would like to draw attention to some of the side monsters, if you will, in this game. There's the titular Minotaur, but there's other little creatures in the game who kind of run out and try to get you, and you have to kill them. There's one over here. You see in the very corner there, it's a little pixelated here, but it's a skeleton. The little animated skeleton that runs around with a sword. Again, like the Kraken, this isn't an idea that actually comes from Greek mythology, but it comes from an extremely influential movie. In this case, 1963's Jason and the Argonauts, with stop motion skeletons done by Ray Harryhausen. Some of you may have seen it. If you haven't, go watch it. So these skeletons are a huge landmark in filmmaking history. They were a big innovation for stop motion animation, but they're also, you know, they're enduringly popular. Homages to them appear all over popular culture. So beyond its choice of monsters, Minotaur engages in further reception with carefully curated past media. Its core game mechanic, obviously this game takes place in a maze, and it's a maze that has unpredictable shifting tiles that the players have to navigate at their own risk. There's a lot in common between the structure of this game and a much older, much stylistically simpler tabletop game from Germany, this 1986 title called Labyrinth. You may or may not have played Labyrinth growing up. It is decently popular here in North America, astronomically influential over in Germany. Over last summer, I did a bit of field work to work on my thesis and went to a couple of board game related sites in Germany, including in Ravensburg, which is the home of the Ravensburger game production company, which is hugely influential. There's a Ravensburger company HQ museum, and they have an entire floor that is just dedicated to Labyrinth, just to the one game. That gives you a bit of a sense of how influential this title is. They had an entire wall in that museum that is just different translations of Labyrinth, updates to the game, expansions, and it fills this whole wall, and there's like very few repetitions. So the amount of reprints gives you a sense of just how popular this game is over in Germany and how much influence it's had on later game designers. The Labyrinth structure in Minotaur is a little bit more elaborate than in Labyrinth, because Labyrinth is a family all ages game, so by nature it has to be a bit simple. And Minotaur's play structure is also different than Labyrinth's in that it's cooperative rather than competitive. The players of Labyrinth are fighting each other to get treasure, and at the end of the game, whoever has the most treasure wins. In Minotaur, the players have to work together, so either they're able to seal the Minotaur within his maze and they all win, or the Minotaur eats them and they all lose. So there's some differences here, but Minotaur really reads like a descendant of and a tribute to Labyrinth. There's two more examples of layered reception I'd like to bring up within Minotaur. and they're both from the world of video games. I already brought up the pixelated artwork style that comes from arcade play. I bring it up again because the idea of tribute is interesting here. The creators of those late 20th century arcade games would have grown up at least somewhat familiar with sword and sandal films in the 1960s. So they would have been familiar with Jason and the Argonauts and Clash of the Titans and all the wonderful creature design that those games involve. There's a more recent video game which also has a Greek mythological theme and ample structural overlap with the game flow of Minotaur. You may have heard of Hades. For those of you who haven't, it's a 2020 indie game, extremely popular. It's having a ton of influence over young Greek mythology fans. When I worked as a TA, I would always put that I like to play Hades in my little introduction at the beginning of the class, and I'd always get a ton of students being like, "You play Hades," and asking me follow-up questions. It was very cute. So Hades has a lot of parallels with a lot of the games I've been talking about. It's got friendly gods who give the player power-ups, very much like in Homer. It's also got hordes of really creatively designed mythological monsters. Like the title character in Minotaur, the monsters in Hades can regenerate. To the chagrin of unlucky players, sometimes they can regenerate in the middle of combat. Very frustrating. Both Hades and Minotaur take place in subterranean realms with stone walls, narrow dungeon pathways, and opponents at every corner. It's this dungeon labyrinth kind of aesthetic that lends itself really well to games. Both of these titles also position the players as outsiders in an underground realm, and the monsters are kind of indigenous inhabitants. That's whenever the monsters are portrayed as like inhabitants and everyday people in a realm and the humans are positioned as outsiders, there's so many interesting cultural implications going on there. The monsters are portrayed in both of these pieces of media as obstacles to player achievement as well as indigenous inhabitants. However, the players are not actively encouraged to think of themselves as invaders or as antagonists. Like in Minotaur, they're going into the labyrinth to do good, or at least to do their idea of good. So through this multitude of influences from different points in time, Minotaur gives its players a subtly multi-temporal experience by mixing visuals and ideas from antiquity, from several decades of the 20th century, and from recent trends in myth and popular media. It ties these influences together in a surprisingly pacifist bundle. I did just mention the kind of complicated indigenous coding, but I think it's a really nice step forward that the game is cooperative with the players working as a team, and that their goal is to curtail the Minotaur instead of killing him. Minotaur and other games in its vein create a strong sense of layered reception, placing the tabletop world in conversation with past decades of media, as well as with antiquity itself. While tabletop games are far from the only space in pop culture that engages with ancient Mediterranean mythology, their interactive nature gives us creative applications of mythological narrative and themes that are seldom seen in other types of media. This is not to say that mythologically inflected tabletop games are superior to other forms of pop culture that deals with myth, nor that they exist in a vacuum. One of the strengths of tabletop engagement with myth is its sheer variety of sources and inspirations, with games that interweave primary sources from antiquity with references to more modern instances of myth reception. The ways in which players of these games are able to interact with gods, goddesses, and monsters mirror the relationships between these entities and moral heroes in mythological texts. Through sharing interactive elements with video games and visuals with many forms of pop culture, tabletop games assert themselves as part of a wider multimedia cultural conversation about the continuous fascination that we have with ancient Greek mythology. Myth references facilitate a multiplicity of readings and interpretations among game players, as well as among consumers of pop culture as a whole. We all bring our own interpretations of myths and opinions on specific stories to the tabletop. You may have noticed that a lot of the mythological characters that I brought up are some of my personal faves, and I am very, very biased, especially in terms of, I really, really like Athena, I really like Odysseus. It was inevitable that I would talk about them quite a bit. So all in all, the portrayal of mythology in tabletop games creates a richness during the experience of play. And that was my talk. I would like to open the floor to questions and comments, but let me explain this QR code first. This is a link to my public research blog. It's called A Reception Collection, and it's where I try to post weekly. Doesn't always happen because grad school is a fickle beast, but it's where I share research findings from my thesis work, but also little tangents that aren't going to make the final cut of my thesis. Yeah. So, questions?
So, just exercise moderator's privilege and start with a bit of out of nowhere question. Came up as we were talking. Are there, you spoke of a space, especially with Minotaur at the very end, where ideas of collaboration, of not killing someone, of almost existing in a benign kind of space where you try to manage difficulty, might speak of progressive, liberal, whatever you want to describe it, politics, and conceptions of being. Is there such a thing as a conservative tabletop games? I was thinking of Haxett's Pentagon hearings, and his the questions about his vision of where women belong.
Yes.
And we see here video games where women lead armies, video games, tabletop games where women historically lead armies and reshape a conception of the world that we have been traditionally gendered. Are there people trying to push back against that by constructing games that are gendered in a traditional way so that kids don't get corrupted by that?
I think, interestingly, most of that kind of conservative backlash comes not in the creation of new games, but in the over promotion of old ones. Conservatives really love Risk and Monopoly, and they're not so keen on trying out new titles. The world of like new tabletop game design, I mean, like any kind of nerdy subaltern media space, there's always going to be bros, technical term, who just want to like build your army, destroy the world kind of games. But the actual sort of, a lot of really, really popular games right now are taking a much more nuanced view of the world. A really, really big trend right now is like biology themed games, where the focus is, it might be competition, but it's not necessarily build an army, destroy your people's city. It's like, we're all birds, survive the migratory cycle, or we're all fungi, find an optimal place to grow and spread. There's, yeah, it's interesting to keep an eye on new releases in the tabletop gaming world because I feel like they just get more and more creative.
We actually have an online.
Oh, fire away.
You mentioned works of literature, but the games seem to remove all the characters from their literary sources. Can you imagine a game where Homer or Sophocles might be acknowledged?
Ooh, glad you asked. I have encountered games where there's a bit more direct engagement with sources. They tend to be more games that are rooted in specific history. There's a title I absolutely adore that's called Downfall of Pompeii, and the rule book has little quotations from Roman texts. Like I think it has a line from Pliny the Elder at the opening of the book. I'm trying to think of any closer engagement with texts. The trouble with board game manuals is they tend to not really cite their sources, and I would love it if some games will have like a little paragraph or two where the main designer talks about their inspiration. I wish every game would do that. Like, I'm going to say something so nerdy. I wish that tabletop games came with a works cited section. Because it's judging by the closeness and the specificity with which these games interact with myth, and also the way they interact with later pop culture, you can tell that a lot of these designers have done their research, even if that research was watching Clash of the Titans a few times. Awesome.
I don't know how much of it is in board games, but in tabletop RPG, especially indie designs, they do tend to list their inspirations.
That's true.
Yeah. Like this is what you should be going for when it's playing, as like a guide.
Yeah, I've had really good experiences with people in Magic the Gathering citing their sources. Like a lot of the A lot of the card artwork designers will have like personal blogs, and some of them will have like a post for every single card they design that talks in detail about their sources. Like that's the kind of specificity that I want to see in tabletop gaming.
I was wondering, I wasn't a very much game person, so I was wondering what defines their popularity. Is there statistics, like which game was played by more people and why also?
There's a lot of, you can easily track the what, like you can find like rankings of most of game sales. And then there's some physical games that have like an online version where you can like play with your friends over distance that unsurprisingly really blew up during COVID. I played a lot of online Settlers of Catan with my friends back then. So you can track which of those games are being played. It's a little harder to track why they're interesting or like why certain titles resonate with people more. There's definitely a link between like awards and publications and popularity. Like any kind of media, tabletop gaming has like yearly awards, and it has like a little awards season. There's one particular German award called Spiel des Jahres, which is like game of the year. And reliably the sales for that, whichever game becomes game of the year, end up spiking. It's kind of like, when a movie gets nominated for an Oscar and people want to see it. The how is not so well documented, which is part of why I'm doing this research. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Dana. So fun. Whenever I hear about these games that are just make me wow. I see them play them. I was thinking about this relationship between the games and these mythological texts, and the way that the format of these games is so it's always open ended, right? It's not a fixed narrative. It's more like a framework or a little world where these different games can play out. They're always going to be different, right? Every time you play. And I was just thinking that in a way that makes it. I wonder if that format of games makes it less potentially controversial as anachronism, or kind of the way departures happen. Adding in the Kraken, for example, like if the format of the game being always open-ended, always being a kind of active imagination, it lends itself to this a little more flexibility than say a retelling. Like I'm thinking as a comparison to Percy Jackson stories.
Yes.
Obviously they're so popular, but then you also hear people kind of complaining like these are not faithful to the myth.
I'm one of them.
About these different formats, that the way that something more closed, like a retelling like the Percy Jackson, as opposed to these more open-ended games that kind of keep getting played and replayed.
You've actually tapped into one of the core tenets of my thesis. One of the main ideas I'm working with is that the replayability and the interactive social nature of tabletop gaming makes them a uniquely nuanced site for historical reception. I do talk about the replayability, but a lot of what I'm talking about is like, if you, me, and Dimitri sit down and play a game, it's going to go one way. But if me and Heather and Wallace play a game, it's going to pan out differently, not just because of the specific choices we make, but just because of who we are as people.
And that, of course, plays. It's interesting that you mentioned Jackson, but it's a book. Yeah. So it's foreclosed already, right?
Yeah.
Whereas this almost taps into the oral tradition, where around a fire with a bard, and we're telling a story.
Totally.
It's gonna play in a different way. So in a way, the board game becomes tabletop game becomes like an opportunity to enact an oral kind of.
Oh, 100%.
Don't have with the closed book,
Yeah.
where you can imagine the colors being different and the heroes having different heights, etc., depending on their experience.
Yeah. And there's other media that does tap into that kind of cyclicality. Like if Hades Town is a piece of theater that really engages with telling the same story over and over again. It plays with the idea of like the story has a sad ending, but maybe this time it will be happy. It never is, but the idea is interesting. But that's a piece of theater. You sit down and watch it. You're not interacting with it.
My question is very much related to which I did a friend's question as well as you mentioned your thesis study. I was really intrigued why you chose tabletop instead of video games, because in my exposure, I felt like I encountered more Greek mythology in video games, for example, Hades, War, and many other things. With board games, I was happy to see that you even include Flux, which is not the original version that I personally own, but I am surprised to find that there was a three.
It's really fun.
It is a great game.
Yeah.
My original question would be: is there anything about ancient Greece mythology and studies that make tabletop gaming more interesting than for you to choose it over video games or single player games like Hades and God of War, or as you say, and my own theory on that is something you mentioned about the cyclical nature of these myths, or there's just abundance of myths, so much so that these social games where you can play again and again and have different outcomes and different stories make it more connected with how the nature, the cyclical nature of the myths.
The truth is, the cyclical and interactive stuff kind of came second in my research. When I first started looking at tabletop games, it was because I had never seen any academic studies on historical reception within gaming. I felt like there was actually a bit of a hole in the world of like academic studies of pop culture. There is already like video game studies is a fairly young field. A lot of the stuff being written about them is very, very new, but it's still a field. There is a world of tabletop game studies, but there's not so much. There's like a few articles here and there, but there haven't been any like big monographs or anything, to the best of my knowledge, about historical reception within tabletop. A lot of the stuff about game studies tends to take a more like education or psychology focus. There's not a lot of people looking at it from a history-based approach. There's some, it's slowly growing, and I live in fear of someone writing this exact paper before I get the chance to defend, but okay, I'm being dramatic. I hope that answers your question.
Was there ever a Gamergate for tabletop? And if not, does that then say something about this particular retelling of mythology, this outlet, and the community that it creates compared to the online unlimited?
Thank Olympus, there hasn't been one, because I'm a woman in tabletop gaming and I don't want to live through that. Yeah, I do generally, like, I have had some very bro-y, male chauvinistic encounters with people who play tabletop games. There is a lot of overlap with video games, but like in some ways it's easier to cut them out. Like you can only play tabletop games with a certain core of friends, depending on what, if you're playing multiplayer video games, it's a little harder to do that. I basically just play single player stuff. Like I play Hades and I play Assassin's Creed, and that's about it.
For the very interesting talk. I wanted to ask something that you gave some information, but if we think of narrative techniques in these games, can we distinguish between different techniques, like, for example, techniques that are akin to the epic stories from mythology or tragic laws, this kind of thing.
Interesting. I mean, I'm so much of the sort of narrative flow, I think it's very hard to predict as a game designer. You can put some pieces in motion that will make the stories that you can create parameters for the story. Like you can say, oh, it ends when this happens, or these are the main players and this is their motive. But what happens in the middle is really up to the players. So I guess in that way, it does have some connectivity with oral tradition. Like you look at Homer and there's like these repetitive epithets or stock scenes, but we know for a fact that the Iliad and Odyssey didn't always sound exactly the way that we have them on paper. This is centuries of build up to the written form, if that makes any sense.
My question, this would be my I want to become more I could definitely feel the quiet nostalgia in the way that the Turkish feel about the capture of this Constantinople. Entering the museum of 1453, that could sense the enormous pride of the Turkish. So I'm just wondering what's the Greek perspective on that tragedy? May 29th, 1453.
Oh, goodness. Yes, of course. That's a little out of my time period, but
if it's pride and accomplishment on the Turkish side, it's tragedy and loss on the Greek side, and mobilized in any kind of possible way, from nuanced engagement with a past that will never be again, to let's go and get back the city on the national side of things. But yes, it's a totemic kind of moment that on both sides will be mobilized for both thoughtful reflection and for catastrophic nationalism. Yeah, but it's certainly there.
Mhm. And those ideas do get picked. It's interesting how they get picked up in popular media. Like, I'm not dealing with board games that tackle Byzantium, but there are a lot of games that deal with the Persian Wars or the Battle of Thermopylae. There are so many Battle of Thermopylae simulators. People are obsessed with that goddamn battle, and there are other historical events. I'll spare you guys my full-blown Sparta rant. I have one locked and loaded.
So, because then we're going into.
Yeah, you want to talk Manosphere. Actually, I didn't, when you were talking about the sort of conservative reaction, a lot of them want to just like role play Leonidas and not really think critically about it.
Well, it didn't seem like they're needed in America about like Greek mythologies, and you mentioned that a lot of the architecture then like they don't kind of match up in general.
Go back.
So I'm wondering, like, where do you think
This one.
where do you think you feel from? I think this kind of like Oriental gaze, like a pleasure, like where do you think why do you think people are drawn to like Greek games now, and especially?
Oh, that is so interesting. I'm so glad you brought it up. The truth, yeah, a lot of the games that I've used as case studies here are American or Canadian designed, but they're coming from this practice that's really, really rooted in Europe, like especially in Central Europe. I had to go to Germany to do my field research because that's where all of the big centralized museums of board games and board game archives live, because this style of gaming really does have its origins in Germany. And German and North American classical reception are somewhat different. They're cousins, where they both look up to an idea of the Greco-Roman past as like the apex of civilization, and try to emulate them in like our architecture, our political systems, our culture. But then, at the expense of other equally valuable, equally interesting ancient cultures, and also to some extent, like at the expense of later Greek and Mediterranean civilizations. Does that kind of make sense? I feel like I only scratched the surface of your question.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's in Santorini.
The tourist gaze.
I mean, why Santorini?
Uh-huh.
I mean, yes, I mean, Thera exists in ancient Greek thought, mostly on the colonial kind of era context, and then you can go and bring it with nuance. But here is where tourism plays a critical role in how we view these spaces.
There's another chapter of my thesis that's about like the aesthetics of tabletop gaming, and I have a whole section in there about tabletop games and tourist imagery of like so much of what we see out in the world of modern Greece is like white sand beaches, beautiful little quaint villages with the whitewashed walls, you know, friendly cats, souvlaki on the beach, whatever. And then there's like contrasted with this ancient history and the interplay of those two ideas of these two like idealized visions of Greece shows up all over the place in pop culture, like right here.
So, thank you, everyone, for attending. I mean, first of all, thank you, Nina, for a very, very, very nice paper. Thank everyone for questions and for pushing the conversation. Also, thank you to our audience online. We can and will continue this conversation or other conversations, aircraft, over snacks and drinks. We're not buying drinks or drinks for the snacks we're buying. So please join us if you would like to spend some more time conversing, and please do go online on the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies website, and we look up our coming events. The Spring Seminar Series is active, and there are events coming up in the coming weeks. So do engage, do keep in touch, and do join us in our future events. Again, thank you so much.